War and Revolution, section. From the Opium Wars to the Rape of Nanking. However, Ferguson's main concern is to differentiate beneficent colonialism and imperialism from the maleficent variety. He effectively describes the murderous orgy that visited China and, in particular, Nanking in the 1930s. The aggressors engaged in a killing competition. In Nanking, quote, between 260,000 and 300,000 non-combatants were killed, end quote. The Japanese troops amused themselves, assaulting women, and practiced sadism on men. Some were buried alive or covered in petrol and set alight. A few were hung by their tongues on metal hooks. Here is the British historian's conclusion. Beginning of long quote. This was imperialism at its very worst, but it was Japanese imperialism, not British. The Rape of Nanking reveals precisely what the leading alternative to British rule in Asia stood for. But it was also the collision between an empire that had some conception of human rights and one that regarded alien races as no better than swine. In the words of Lieutenant Colonel Ryukichi Tanaka, director of the Japanese Secret Service in Shanghai, we can do anything to such creatures. By the 1930s, many people in Britain had got into the habit of rubbishing the empire. But the rise of the Japanese Empire in Asia during that decade showed that the alternatives to British rule were not necessarily more benign. There were degrees of imperialism, and in its brutality toward conquered peoples, Japan's empire went beyond anything the British Empire had ever done. End of long quote. This passage starts with an observation that is obvious, even banal. It is always useful and appropriate to apply the art of distinction. Compared with their competitors, both the Third Reich and the Empire of the Rising Sun appeared on the historical scene late. Because participation of the world had already been largely accomplished, they were led to target peoples of established or old and antique civilization, who could be reduced to the condition of savage tribes only through a massive dose of supplementary violence and brutality. They embarked on the work of colonial subjugation at a time when the anti-colonial revolution was already underway. In such circumstances, the barbarism of imperialism obviously underwent further escalation. However, even accepting the distinction between the British Empire and the Empire of the Rising Sun, it is not clear why an Asian country like China, of continental dimensions and antique civilization, had to choose between them. We know that the Japanese Empire sought to learn, and did indeed learn, from its British counterpart. If we wish to reconstruct the process of ideological preparation of the Rape of Nanking, more than a few pages should be devoted to Great Britain and the West as a whole. At the start of the Second Opium War, which ended with the sacking and burning of the splendid Summer Palace, John Stuart Mill called for the invading army to teach the Chinese barbarians a harsh lesson. It was not appropriate to quibble about formalities. Quote, appeals to humanity and Christianity in favor of ruffians, and to international law in favor of peoples who recognize no laws of war at all, were ridiculous. End quote. Some decades later, in 1900, a new, more massive punitive expedition was launched against China. Haranguing German troops preparing to depart for Asia, Wilhelm II left them in no doubts about the modalities that should govern the repression of the Boxer Rebellion and the lesson to be taught the Chinese people as a whole. Quote, give the world an example of virility and discipline. No pardon will be given, and no prisoners will be taken. Anyone who falls into your hands falls to your sword. Make the name German remembered in China for 1,000 years, so that no Chinaman will ever again dare to squint at a German. End quote. And indeed, let us take a glance at the sequel to the defeat of the barbarians. Beginning of long quote from Ferguson. There then began systematic carnage and sacking, which went far beyond the excesses of the Boxers. In Beijing, thousands of men were massacred in a savage orgy of violence. Women and whole families committed suicide so as to not suffer being dishonored. The whole city was sacked. The imperial palace was occupied and robbed of the bulk of its treasures. A similar situation obtained in Tientsin and Baoding. Punitive expeditions were undertaken in the rural areas of Zili, where missionaries had been attacked. Foreign soldiers razed entire villages to the ground and spared nothing. In Manchuria, where the Russians were responsible for the pacification, the atrocities were on the same scale. In reprisal for the shots fired on the city of Blagoveshchensk, thousands of Chinese, men, women, and children, had their throats cut and their bodies were thrown into the Heilongjiang. End of long quote. The rape of Nanking involved horror on a larger scale and even more unbridled barbarism. But it was 37 years earlier that imperialist Japan had proved its mettle in China, participating in the punitive expedition of 1900 alongside Britain, the USA, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. Its horror did not elicit a wave of indignation in the West. In fact, the French general H.N. Frey credited it with having, quote, for the first time translated into reality the dream of idealist politicians, a United States of the civilized world, end quote. It was Lenin, the great critic of imperialism, who reported and ridiculed this assessment. He denounced the colonialist violence inflicted on, quote, the unarmed Chinese populace, who were drowned or killed, with no holding back from the slaughter of women and children, not to speak of the looting of palaces, homes, and shops, end quote. Russian soldiers and the invaders generally had attacked, quote, like savage beasts, burning down whole villages, shooting, bayoneting, and drowning in the Amur River unarmed inhabitants, their wives, and their children, end quote. Yet such infamy had been celebrated as a civilizing mission by the dominant classes, the, quote, press that kowtows to them, and ultimately by much or even most of public opinion, not only Russian, but Western in general. In any event, for having participated, quote, on an equal footing with the European or Western powers, in the punitive expedition against the Boxers, and made themselves jointly responsible for the horror, Japan was co-opted into the exclusive club of great powers, whose right to colonize and civilize barbarians was recognized. This change was subsequently formally sealed, quote, by the Anglo-Japanese Treaty, Japan had become a great power, and so, in the statistics of the Dutch East Indies, had to figure among the European and not among the Asian states, end quote. The First World War then intervened. The Empire of the Rising Sun fought on the side of the Entente, which recognized its right to inherit defeated Germany's colonial possessions in China. While imperialist and militarist Japan could now boast equal dignity with the great capitalist powers of the West, in Western eyes, China remained Asiatic and barbarous, and thus part of the colonial or colonizable world, even though it had rid itself of the Manchu dynasty and reconstituted itself as a democratic republic in the meantime. This is the starting point for understanding the Japanese Empire's subsequent attempt to subject the most populous country on earth to its rule. The rape of Nanking, and the other infamies bound up with it, cannot be separated from the history of imperialism as a whole, a history in which the Western great powers enjoyed a position of absolute preeminence. Basically, as Ferguson himself acknowledges, quote, the Japanese merely inserted themselves into the privileged position hitherto occupied by the British, end quote. But it was the West that had much earlier defined the pyramid of peoples and races, the hierarchy on the basis of which peoples and races on a higher rung were granted the right to subjugate, and, if needs be, drastically decimate people and races of inferior rank. The only thing we need to add is that the processes of co-option were inherently fragile. While the Japanese treated the Chinese, degraded to the status of an inferior race, with particular ferocity, they in turn suffered a process of racialization by the USA during the Second World War, which occasionally went as far as envisaging a kind of final solution of the Japanese question. End section.